Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bella Gamer, and we're back with another archetype from the Tian Xia character guide. I figure I'd do the Tian Xia character guide first, since it's the newest one. These are the archetypes that people don't know about the most, so would be the most interested in listening to. And plus, it's a book I've just recently gone through anyway, so much of the information is still fresh in my head. So yeah, but if there are any archetypes in the most recent books that you do want me to cover, please let me know it down in the comments below. First of all, let's talk about the 5-Breath Warriors, or Vanguard, sorry. The 5-Breath Vanguard is an interesting archetype and one that I really, really enjoy, because the whole premise of the archetype is to cycle through elemental stances. These stances are ones that have elemental traits or elemental theming like Ironblood. So you cycle through these stances during combat, meaning you must know multiple stances in order to make use of this, but it rewards you for swapping up. So you don't have a regular play style, or at least your play style kind of goes in different cycles that you go through. And this is something I want to see more in archetypes. 5-Breath Vanguard could honestly have just been a variation of like a class archetype, because you can really only play this as a monk. Granted, if you multi-class archetype into monk, pick a couple of these stances up, and then do 5-Breath Vanguard, then of course you could do it that way. But this is predominantly purely a monk-based archetype, which I'm fine with, honestly. I think it's really interesting, and it utilizes one of the aspects of monk very well, which is changing stances or having many different kinds of stances, a factor that most other classes don't really have. And I hope we get to see more archetypes kind of implement some of these aspects of some of the classes that are unique to them. You know, archetypes that use, like, for instance, if there's an archetype based on reloading, well, the gunslinger gets a lot of reloading based feats, and so would benefit heavily from that kind of archetype, just as an example. But the 5-Breath Vanguard is essentially a type of elementalist's kung fu school that goes off of the idea of the elemental cycle, how it does in the lore, and getting strength or adapting to different situations through cycling through your stances. I think this particular archetype adds a lot of interesting new methods of playing the game, and so this is one that I think is definitely like a top grade archetype. Granted, it only really works for monk, or at least for monk best, but still really, really good. So looking at the dedication itself, you'll notice that this is a level 6 archetype, which means you can't pick this up until level 6, making it what I would call an advanced archetype, one that requires more levels than others. Now, this one does require that you know 2 of the elemental stances, and it gives the whole list here of Ironblood, Mountain Stance, Reflected Ripple, Stoked Flame, and Tangled Forest Stance. Now, I do know some of these are more used than others, but due to the use of this archetype, this can actually make some of them, like maybe Tangled Forest Stance, much more relevant in different styles of play. Now, because we're going to be cycling through these, and I'll talk about that here in a moment, I will make mention that if you build your character to utilize the extra traits of some of these stances more than others, that might cause some problems. But that's why the 5-Breath Vanguard comes a little bit later, when you have more of an idea of your character. And I feel like this is the kind of archetype you build into rather than take a part of your build. So I definitely would say if you plan on using this archetype, that's your plan. Don't just throw this willy-nilly onto any of your monk builds, because it requires a very specific style of play, I think, to make the most use out of. And it can interrupt kind of your general flow, ironically, if you're planning on using certain traits of a stance, but you're being forced to swap to get the benefits of this particular archetype. So with this archetype dedication, you get the Cycle Elemental Stance. Cycle Elemental Stance is a singular action that you can take on your turn to either step and or stride, and then swap from one stance to another. Now, you have to be in an elemental stance to make use of this, which I do find a little bit lamentable, because this would be really great as an initiation. You get to move into combat and then get into your stance. But that's not how it works. This is purely for swapping from one stance to another. So the best practice for this is to move up to your enemy, get into your elemental stance, do a flurry of blows, and then on your next turn is when you can really start worrying about cycling into your elemental stances. Another thing I really like about this is because it swaps stances and allows you to step, you can use this to maneuver around an enemy to get into a more advantageous position, which really works with the theme of the particular archetype because it's all about kind of getting into the form that best suits the situation. So I really, really do like this. As a pure dedication feat, I think this is a really good start. Next up, we have Renewing Cycle. Now, you'll notice this one is a level 10 feat. This means that 5 Breath Vanguard is not great for anyone who's planning on doing multi-class archetyping, unless, I guess if you're taking the free or the bonus archetype rule, then this is not that bad because typically you get done with your first archetype at level 6 and you would have to pick this one at level 8, but then level 10 would be the next feat. But this is actually really common in this archetype because the next feat after this one is level 14. So there's a lot of gaps in 5 Breath Vanguard, making this more of a supplement to Monk than an actual archetype. I mean, obviously, duh, but if you're using bonus archetype rules, just know this particular archetype is going to be a little bit of a mess unless you start picking it up like at level 10, because then you can do it every even level after that and have no problems. But Renewing Cycle as a feat is really good. So Renewing Cycle allows you to, whenever the first time in a round, that's very important dialogue, in a round that you cycle elemental stance, you gain an amount of temporary HP. This temporary HP is equal to half your level and lasts until the start of your next turn. Now, you can only do this once per stance until you cycle through all your elemental stances. So this particular feat kind of benefits you more if you're cycling between 2 stances in particular, or even maybe 3. But I would say in particular that if you're going the full route, then it's going to be fine. Like, there's not really a way you can do this poorly unless you have 3 stances, but you're only swapping between 2. So as long as you're intentionally cycling, you're going to consistently have temp HP equal to half your level, which is really strong. But it says the first time every round. That's relevant to a feat we're going to talk about here a little bit later. But this is a really, really good follow-up feat and is very powerful. Next up at level 14, so again, we have another level gap. We have Induce Imbalance. Now, this is a particular action that takes 2 actions and has the Flourish trait. Now, with this, you strike using an elemental strike stance. So one of the things with many of the elemental stances is they don't forbid you from using other types of strikes, which is important to note. But you do need to use the elemental strike from the stance you're currently in to make use of this. And when you strike the enemy, they need to make a fortitude save against your class DC, or they become clumsy 2 or clumsy 3 on a crit fail. Now, this is a save or suck ability. If they do succeed, nothing happens, and you use 2 actions to make a singular strike. Now, while that would be a little bit of a limitation here, it's not really that big of a deal because you just get to strike. You could make another strike against the opponents as long as that strike isn't a flurry, or not flurry, a flourish. So that being said, you still could strike an enemy like the same number of times you normally would in a round. You just wouldn't really get to do anything else. Though I am assuming that the intent is you would cycle, regain some of temporary HP from Renewing Cycle, and then use this strike, which, is less damage efficient, but the chance of making an enemy clumsy 2 is really good because not only is that going to reduce their AC just by a flat 2 amount, it's also going to make any dex-based attacks they have worse and any their reflex save worse as well. So it's a really good attack to make. I wouldn't overuse it necessarily unless your intent is to be like a team support character. And I would use this more as My team is all here and we're damaging it a lot, so let's see if we can make this thing take even more damage. You only want to use this when you have multiple teammates attacking the same creature so that they can benefit from the reduced AC. Otherwise, if you're just facing off with a creature yourself, passing over the imbalance or induce imbalance is probably for the best for another type of strike or strike action. Especially if you're a monk, I'd probably just flurry of blows and just try to get a volume of attacks in with fainting intermixed or something like that. At level 16, we have Protective Cycle. Now, this is the one that I was talking about earlier with Renewing Cycle, because as a reaction to taking damage, you swap your elemental stance and you gain a +2 to your AC, circumstance bonus to your AC. But if this is the first time in that round, so since the start of your last turn, that you've swapped elemental stances for whatever reason, then you gain temp HP as well. So there can be something said for, depending on how the rotation of the combat is going, if you know like a lesser enemy is going before the boss, maybe you want to have those temp HP for the boss's hit rather than getting that whittled away by the lesser enemy. So you don't swap stance on your turn and instead wait for the lesser enemy to hit you, swap your stance, get a big boost to your AC against the boss, and get some temp HP on top. Even if that's not the route, just getting that bonus to your AC is huge, especially if you're playing a monk who has to really depend on not wearing armor for a lot of their stuff, and thus kind of being at an AC disadvantage when it comes to heavy armor characters, for instance. So I would say this is pretty good, and it introduces a new way you can use one of our prior feats, which is really good design. Now, there is one more feat that I'm going to be talking about, but as typical, before we get to that final feat here, which is called 5 Breaths, 1 Death, so you don't want to miss out on that. If you're enjoying the content, leave a like. In fact, I encourage you to leave a like on any kind of TTRPG content that you watch. The more people that are liking TTRPG content, hopefully the better the algorithm likes TTRPG content, and we can get more kind of TTRPG content on YouTube. Obviously, if it's D&D, I mean, people are liking and doing that stuff anyway, but I really recommend for other TTRPGs to do it as well, as I want to try at least to boost with my channel to lift all ships by showing a level of interest on the platform. And if you like my content specifically, I recommend subscribing. I got so much to cover in the coming months when it comes to TTRPG related content. Predominantly, we got some new Pathfinder books coming out next month and the month after. So if you want to get that information about a week or two before it releases to the public, I tend to get it a little bit early and I share it with all of you. And I'm going to make special mention, next year, I just learned we have 5 new TTRPGs coming out. We have the MCDM's Draw Steel, we have DC 20, we have the Cosmere RPG, we have Starfinder 2nd Edition, all coming out next year, and I'm going to be doing my best to cover all of that. So if you want a channel that has really good diversity in TTRPG content, also I recommend subscribing to this channel. All right, the spiel is done. Let's go ahead and talk about 5 Breaths, 1 Death. So this is a very interesting action that actually gets amplified based on the number of stances that you know. So it's a 3-action attack, well, a series of attacks that also has the death trait, even though it's not mentioned here. I really wish they would put it in there because it is generally a part of it. But essentially what happens is you have to be in an elemental stance, which is pretty typical for this particular archetype. You strike the enemy, and then you do elemental cycle, which allows you to step and or stride, and then you do another elemental strike with the next stance that you're in, and you do this on repeat until you go through every elemental stance that you know. Now, this does apply map as normal, which is your multi-attack penalty, but the interesting thing about this, as this 1/3 action ability allows us to strike and step or stride essentially equal to the number of stances. Technically, we get 1 less step or stride than number of stances we have, but still, That's a lot. So if you know all 5 stances, you can make 5 strikes with this particular set of actions. And if you have Renewing Cycle from earlier in the archetype, the first one that you do gives you temporary HP until the start of your next turn. Now, if you manage to strike an enemy with all 5 specifically of the elemental stances, they need to make a fortitude save against your class DC or they die. Has the death trait, but not incapacitation. Now, getting 5 successful strikes off with map is insanely difficult. Many of your strikes are going to be at -10 or -8 if they have agile. That's really rough. That's not the point. The point of the 1 death part isn't necessarily to get the death effect off as much as possible. In actuality, the whole benefit of this 1 feat is if you know 5 stances, you can make 5 attacks and 4 steps and or strides and regain temp HP, all with essentially a full round set of actions. Honestly, if you have 5 stances, when you hit the end game with this, you're going to be using this as much as you can, as long as you're at least adjacent to an enemy, because you get to just step or stride and strike as many times as you really can, and you're a monk and you're really, really fast. Now, the one downside of this one in particular is that the enemy is under the effects of Induce imbalance. Now, this is kind of where it generally falls apart. Because the enemy needs to be under the effects of Induce imbalance, essentially, the enemy needs to fail your save against Induce imbalance, which is a little bit difficult and harder to get off on bosses more than anything. But the effects of Induce imbalance do last until the end of your next turn. And it creates a very interesting combo where 1 round you set up, you get your Induce imbalance off. Next round, you go and you do the 5 breaths and 1 death mega attack, essentially, which is really, really strong. Then you need to go back and do Induce imbalance again, unless you critical the enemy with Induce imbalance, in which case they're under the effects essentially for a minute, which is really devastating. So this is really cool. It's a really cool finisher. You get a level 18. I just wish that it wasn't so based on use of Induce imbalance, because Induce imbalance is a little damage inefficient. It's got really good effects, true, but depending on the enemy's fortitude save, which fortitude save tends to be one of the higher saves in the game, it can be really hard to make an enemy at least fail, and nothing happens if they succeed. So you're doing an action that's likely going to result in a waste of an action on your turn to hope to set yourself up to do this big mega action where half the attacks are going to be done at your highest multi-attack penalty. So, it's something that, it sounds really, really good on paper, but in practice, I feel like it's just a little much. I think the 5 breaths, 1 death would be really good without the prerequisite that the enemy is currently under the effects of Induce imbalance. Though, I guess I will say if the enemy is under the effects of Induce imbalance, you're more likely to hit the enemy 10 times or 5 times. So, it kind of works a little bit. But yeah, it's a really good feat. It can be a little tricky to get off, especially towards the end game. But yeah, that is the 5 breaths Vanguard. A really good, I would say, essentially a monk class archetype. You don't have to be a monk, but a monk is the best one for it, honestly speaking, unless you really just decided, I don't want any class feats. I want to have all monk feats and be some other class. Maybe like a fighter, possibly. But yeah, it's very good. I will say that this is a really good one. I do like how it works. I like how it changes the dynamic of how you approach combat. And it can be a lot of fun. This is a really, really good archetype. This is definitely an A rank archetype. The only reason why it's not an S for me personally is purely because it mostly is just a monk archetype, meaning most characters won't get the full benefit of this particular archetype, but still, it's incredibly solid. So that's going to be it for me. Hope you enjoyed the video. I got plenty more for Tian Xia and the other Pathfinder books coming out. and new content on the horizon. So stay tuned. But that's going to be it for me. Thank y'all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye.